Okay, it looks like all the panelists have arrived. So welcome, everybody. My name is Mackenzie Thornbury, and I am a CSPC Program Committee member. We acknowledge that the Canadian Science Policy Conference is taking place on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate on this land. We are about to participate in an interactive panel titled Building the Circular Bioeconomy Through Innovation Policy Design and Implementation, organized by Genome Canada. Please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy or #CSPC 2022. Finally, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey for this session and all the sessions you've attended to make CSPC even better for next year. Thank you and enjoy the panel.
Is this on? Hello? We're good? Perfect. Hi, everybody. You guys have entered, welcome to those who are here. Just sit on this panel session entitled Building the Circular Bioeconomy Through Innovative Policy Design and Implementation. My name is Biru Amy Young. I am a program manager, or one of the program managers at Genome Canada, but you can all just call me Amy. And before we get started, we just heard a statement, but I would like to also begin this event with a territorial acknowledgement on behalf of Genome Canada, as a reminder and a call to action for ourselves and others. We are hosting this panel on traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We acknowledge the traditional guardians of these territories and honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. We recognize past and ongoing injustices perpetrated against Indigenous peoples as part of the colonial project in Canada, including violence, oppression, land theft, and harmful attempts to erase culture. We acknowledge our responsibility to advance genomics in a manner that respects the traditional lands on which we work and incorporate Indigenous knowledge systems in the research and innovation ecosystem. So for those of you who don't know who Genome Canada is or have never heard of Genome Canada, we are a federally funded, not-for-profit organization who, working in partnership and across sectors, invests in and coordinates genomics research, innovation, data, and talent to generate solutions to today's biggest challenges. We have a 20-year history of funding Canadian genomics research and work with an enterprise of genomics centers across the country to make this innovation happen. Now, before we begin today's discussion, I'd like to actually introduce you to my panelists here. To begin with is Megan Seagrave, the Executive Director of Bioindustrial Innovation Canada, a high-impact NPO accelerator providing critical strategic investment, advice, and services to business developers of clean, green, and sustainable technologies. With her range of work experience, she's a nationally recognized thought leader in the bioeconomy and has been spearheading research and innovation opportunities across Canada with over 2 decades of making her a knowledgeable and diverse research and entrepreneurial support in the Atlantic region. And then next to her, we have Jeff Passmore, CEO of Passmore Group, a management consultancy focused on providing clients with the tools that lead the more rapid commercialization of technologies in the bioeconomy and clean tech sectors. He has over 40 years of working experience in the renewable energy, renewable chemicals, and industrial bioeconomy sectors, and he's attracted foreign direct investment in a lot of Canadian businesses. Additionally, he is the chair of the Canada's annual Industrial Bioeconomy Business Conference, Scaling Up, which happened to have happened just last week, if you were there. And finally, sitting on the very end there, we have our third panelist and my colleague, Ryan Philippe, who's the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Genome Canada. And unfortunately, if you guys were here to see Mahima Sharma, she could not make it. She is the Director of Environment and Innovation and Mill Regulations at Forest Products Association Canada. But fortunately, she sent me some of her remarks, and we also have Ryan here to sit on the panel today. A little bit about Ryan. He develops the Genome Canada's strategic approach to investment and innovation. He brings deep experience in strategic development and biotechnology in academia, private research, and industry to his role. As an academic, Ryan's research focused on genomics, biochemistry, and protein engineering in plants. He spent a decade in the U.S. building a synthetic biology and a precision fermentation startup, working in both the technical and the business capacities, and was able to grow the company from an idea to a fully scaled and vertically integrated biomanufacturing company. He is very committed to advancing innovation in Canada and contributing to the development of our national and global bioeconomy. So with all that being said and done, I'd actually like to get started on the discussion that we're going to have today. If you don't mind switching to our sets of panels, and next slide, and the next slide. We're going to start off with the basic question that maybe some of you have at the top of your heads is, what is the circular bioeconomy, and why is it so important in Canada? Now, we do have a poll question for you, but this is also kind of something to sort of think about in that mind. And as you guys start polling, we'd also like to hear from our panelists about it. So Megan, why don't you start? Mic 2's on.
Hello. That works? Great. Thanks so much for attending. I'm hoping that this can be a little bit more of a discussion and less of us talking at you, I guess, and talking more with you. So I thought this might be an interesting time to actually mention bioeconomy and circular economy, the differences between them and how they are interlinked, because those terms get utilized very interchangeably, yet they are different. So the bioeconomy is really about substituting fossil carbon with bio-based carbon from biological sources. A good example of that would be bioenergy or bio-based products coming from agriculture, forestry, fisheries. When we talk about the circular economy, it's really about circularity, recycling carbon that's already in the system to reduce and ease impact of new fossil coming into that circular system. So think about recycling of rare earths, magnets, metals, minerals in something like the EV, electric vehicle, and battery sort of sectors. I guess the other piece to that is they can work together in industries and they can work together in sectors. And when you think about that, both of them are cross-sectoral. So a really good example, because I mentioned the EVs, a really good example would be the automotive sector. If we think about where the bioeconomy might fit into the automotive sector, think about the seats that you would sit on hopping into your car. Ford, as an example, has been using soy foam, so soy-based foams in their Ford Mustangs for about 30 years now. So they're already part of that bioeconomy. When we talk about maybe the automotive sector from a circularity perspective, what's going to happen with that, with the new investment happening here in Ontario with the EV coming into Chrysler's manufacturing? So how are we going to recirculate and renew those batteries within that sector? So you can see that we're talking about two distinct pieces here, but they are definitely interconnected. And maybe something else to just throw out there is I'll probably jump into, and I suspect Jeff will jump into this too, is when we talk about circularity and bioeconomy, we talk cross-sectoral. So when we're talking about research and innovation, this is cross-sectoral. This is not individual line sectors or departments, federally, provincially, you name it. And we also talk about value chains. So if I use that automotive example again and talk about a value chain, you can see that we've got agriculture coming in early on within a value chain, but getting sort of an uptake from a manufacturing perspective. And then on a circularity perspective, you can see where the EV recirculation of battery technology would happen further down in that value chain.
Awesome. Hello, testing. Awesome. Thank you so much. Now on to Jeff.
Thank you. I was going to start my remarks by thanking Genome Canada for having invited me on this panel, but after Amy made me feel so youthful, I'm not sure whether or not yeah, it's been a long time, and it's time to pass the torch. I think the definition of the industrial bioeconomy, just so we know what we're talking about here, because bioeconomy writ large includes biopharma. So we're not talking about biopharma here today. We're talking about the industrial bioeconomy, and there's parts of that everybody's very familiar with, ethanol in gasoline or renewable diesel, or more recently, sustainable aviation fuels, because of course the airline industry is very concerned about how they're going to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. And then, of course, bioenergy for heat and electricity, which First Nations could easily be getting off flying in diesel fuel and replacing it with biomass, putting in a biomass boiler, since they're surrounded by forests, many of these remote communities. But the really exciting part about the bioeconomy, and Megan alluded to this, is the biochemistry, the biochemicals, everything that comes from hydrocarbons could instead come from carbohydrates. We're talking paint, plastics, textiles, personal care products, cosmetics. One of the speakers at last week's Scaling Up conference, and thanks, Amy, for the plug for last week's conference. And Scaling Up basically deals with the, if you think of commercialization of fundamental research, applied research, pilot demo, and then large-scale commercial rollout. We're at the back end of that, where everybody's done their research and built a pilot plant, and now how do we commercialize, and what are the challenges associated with that? But so thanks for that promo, and we're already thinking about what the content will be for next year's conference. But back to the definition of the industrial bioeconomy. Yes, the exciting things I think are all those personal care products and paints and plastics. And one of the speakers, she was the deputy head of mission for the Finnish embassy here in Ottawa, and her comment was, and the Finns and the Swedes and all the Scandinavian countries do a much better job of managing their forests and harvesting their forests on a per capita basis than Canada does. We think we're great, but we're not. But her comment was, everything that comes from plastics could come from wood. Well, I would have said it can come from biomass, but the point is the same. There's a huge opportunity there that Canada is missing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I guess, as we go through the discussion.
Absolutely, thank you. And finally, Ryan.
Well, I think a lot of it's been said. I think parsing out the circular from the bioeconomy is very important. I mean, there's often a conflating angle there of sustainability, right? And you could have a bioeconomy that is not sustainable. You could have circularity that is ultimately not sustainable. So all three go together, but when properly executed, they're both required. They're all required to make sure that it actually happens. And it sort of exemplifies that cross-sectoral concept, the systems level approach that is required for achieving something like a integrated circular bioeconomy. Even just bioeconomy nationally, right? There's a broad national opportunity for Canada in terms of the various aspects, economic development, social development, environmental development, that is made possible by the bioeconomy, but it's a highly regional thing, right? There's an aspect of biomass. There's different kinds of biomass, whether you're talking about aquatic or crop or wood. And then ultimately, you're talking about the ability to convert carbon into something else, right? We've been doing it for a long time by cracking and recombining petroleum. Essentially, it's a similar concept, but you have to now adapt your supply chains, your value chains to make it viable to use a different source of carbon, one that is produced ultimately from sunlight, air, and water. So water is very important, land is very important, an abundance of carbon, which Canada has in spades. I learned at the Scaling Up conference that we have 60% of water on the globe, right? So we are in a very advantaged position in that regard. So we have all of the things that we need, including a highly educated base workforce and the ability to reskill an entire sector in the oil and gas industry that has been fundamentally trained for what is required to achieve the circular bioeconomy. But what we really need is the ability to bridge this high complexity system that involves so many different stakeholders, which if we don't communicate properly, some people will devolve to a zero-sum game. I'm losing too much in order to achieve these ends. And so they rely on sticks rather than carrots for policy, different types of approaches here. So bringing the stakeholders together in a way that allows us to coordinate the resources that we have distributed across the region, distributed across the nation, so that we can lead this effort moving ahead and realize the opportunity for Canada is going to be very important. So the policies that allow us to identify the opportunities, but also address the barriers that these various stakeholders all have, but fail to appreciate at the systems level is going to be very interesting. It's like the parable of the blind man with the elephant. Everybody's touching a different part of that elephant and experiencing a different reality. But it's really by working together that we're going to be able to tackle that elephant in the room.
I always like working with Ryan because he always says a lot and it's very, very immersive. And so I guess if you're looking at that particular slide and you're wondering, well, it's probably E, all of the above from what we've been hearing from our panelists here. And from Ryan's notes, I guess that kind of leads into sort of our next sort of question that I have for you guys, which is what are the barriers to implementation? We have all this resource, we have this ability, but why is it so hard for us to sort of implement this sort of national bioeconomy framework, ecosystem, or strategy, really? And maybe, Jeff, I'll throw this over to you first.
Thank you, Amy. The barriers, let me just start by talking about the extent of the resource first. Canada has 348 million hectares of forest. That's 9% of the world's. We have 60 million hectares of agriculture land. And then we have all other kinds of stuff. And Megan's from the East Coast, so she can talk about some of the aquatic. But even just looking at agriculture and forestry, and 60 countries in the world have national bioeconomy strategies. Canada is not among them. The U.S. has had it since 2012, Finland since 2014. France has one, Spain has one, the UK has one, the European Commission has one, Costa Rica even has one, for goodness sakes. Now, maybe I shouldn't say for goodness sakes, Costa Rica has a reputation for being concerned about the environment. But now, industry doesn't need there to be a national strategy in order for it to get on with doing stuff, but it certainly helps create an environment of confidence. You know, everybody's familiar with the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. I like to use the phrase that certainty is the mother of investment. And what a national bioeconomy strategy does is create that level of certainty, that this is something that the government is committed to. We can count on long-term stability where things aren't going to change on the policy environment too much. The government has laid out a strategy that it wants to see going forward. That's what the Americans have been doing. Like I said, theirs has been in place since 2012. We've been talking to Agriculture Canada and to Natural Resources Canada. Frankly, I think it should be led by ICED with input from NRCan and Agriculture Canada. And this maybe speaks to one of the barriers. Too often our departments are working, you talked about silos, Megan, earlier. There's a little bit of silo mentality there. There's been interest in doing this. You get positive feedback from government officials saying, oh yeah, this is something we should do. Natural Resources Canada has a forest bioeconomy framework. I'm not sure what a framework is versus a strategy, but it needs to involve more than just forestry. It should lay out the plan for all of Canada's biomass resources. I'll stop there and let Megan have a go, and then maybe I'll think of something else.
I think you touched on a whole slew of really great points. So we're talking about research and development that's cross-sectoral and innovation that follows value chains and not specific industries or sectors per se. So without a strategy for Canada and for Canada's bioeconomy, circular economy, whichever way you want to put it, we won't have the ability to even put together policy or regulatory, and then we won't have the ability to align funding and programming. So we're kind of tackling it a little bit backwards here in Canada. We need to help the federal government and our individual provincial governments connect the dots to create the financial support around research and innovation. We need to support, we need to create the policy and regulatory mechanisms that are, as Jeff said, going to de-risk investment. So back to whatever the framework, so to speak, is, doing that individually along line departments isn't going to work for investors. So this is, again, cross-sectoral. We need to support the ability to scale up early stage technology, which is extremely CapEx heavy, but those technologies often get framed under bioeconomy and circular economy, so they can't target things like our supercluster, existing supercluster investments. They can't go after Innovation Canada money because they're usually not at a late enough stage, and they're not able to put those 50-cent dollars on the table. We're talking, tens, hundreds of millions and billion-dollar CapEx projects. We're not talking about $100,000 CapEx projects, which you might see in, IT or ICT. We need to consider engaging with our existing MNEs in our backyard, especially around the manufacturing sector. to be early adopters of some of these technologies. So again, that goes back to, this isn't a sector by sector thing. This is very much cross-sectoral. Without a strategy, we're not going to have programming. We're not going to have funding mechanisms, and then everything is going to remain in those sector silos, and they're going to remain sector silos provincially and federally as well. Maybe I'll stop there and we can keep going.
Absolutely. Maybe before we pass it on to Ryan, I just wanted to bring up a point that Mahima had sent me in regards to the forestry sector, because she does work for FPAC, which is focused in the forestry sector. And Jeff, you brought up the fact that there has been some progress made in the forestry sector, but it's not, and it should be stretched out to all of the sectors, truly. But from Mahima's point, even though we say there's been some progress, it hasn't been substantial. Only last week did the Canadian Council for Forest Ministers endorse a renewed forest bioeconomy framework that was an update from the one from 2019. And that's only the first couple steps in order to actually get that this sort of process started. So we haven't made the most within the sector, and she mentions that it's a good step in the right direction, and we hope that this can help lead to greater advancements of these types of frameworks or these types of strategies that are coming out of the government that can really then drive the sort of industry aspect of it. But still, a lot of work has to be done, and it leads back into policy as well, which Megan, you have mentioned. But Ryan, sort of where are your opinions coming in when it comes to these sort of barriers or to implementation into innovation on the side?
Well, I guess I could share different opinions, but I'll pick up on what you were saying, Megan, about the alignment of funding. I think is from Genome Canada's perspective, we have a long history of funding research and innovation, and really high quality research, large scale projects, bringing together consortia of scientists to tackle big questions in science, and then also a history of funding research that's designed to get out to receptors, designed to get out to industry to sort of drive that uptake. But there are much bigger drivers for something at a systems level when you're talking about a bioeconomy, right? There's the integration, making sure that research actually has a path towards implementation, actually has a path towards getting to market. So there is the overarching framework that needs to be shaping this so that the players can figure out how to be interacting properly. But there's a match made in heaven when you're talking about an organization like Genome Canada working with Bioindustrial Innovation Canada, where we can do things at an earlier stage and they have expertise at a later stage, where if we properly coordinate and integrate what it is that we're doing, we are able to increase that ability to drive towards implementation, have the right programs and things moving ahead. But at the end of the day, I think for us on the research fueling side of things, it's really getting that perspective of that pull into the minds of the researchers and into the programs that we structure. Because you see this a lot with, the biomass-driven component of the bioeconomy has some fairly mature, actually quite advanced technology. I mean, like Jeff says, ethanol has been around for a long time. It's part of our fundamental infrastructure in North America and around the world. But there's this tendency when you go to the university to pursue that next big thing, right? Synthetic biology, metabolic engineering, protein engineering, those kinds of things. And a lot of times we're plagued with this mentality of, if I build it, they will come, right? Like I build this cool widget and the market will be there when I try to bring it to market, when I bring it far enough along. And so we need to be able to, I think, integrate the types of research that we do to be more in that Pasteur quadrant of research, right? So not so much the pure research for research's sake, but not at the same time the Edison quadrant of I don't care how it works as long as I build my light bulb, but really knowledge, learning driven research that also has a path to impact. That path is created through the partnerships. So addressing our own barriers on the research side is a task, but it's relatively easy. I think we are looking at a situation where we need to work together to let that science drive the policies that are going to be required to have those broader barriers to uptake, that consistency of investment that's going to be required to enable those technologies to come to market. Because if we keep investing in research, it's just dies on the vine or goes somewhere else to another jurisdiction and doesn't realize value here in Canada.
Yeah, I remember, Ryan, a conversation we had when thinking about this panel, and I asked the question, does science drive policy or does policy drive science? But parking that for a minute, there's a couple of thoughts that I've had, and we are supposed to be talking about circularity here, and one of the barriers that I overlooked was there is a lot of pushback in the environmental community about harvesting trees. And, you know, you can look at what the Scandinavians are doing, and on a per capita basis, harvesting far more wood than we do. Canada's forests lose far more from insect infestation and forest fires than is ever harvested, not to mention the fact that the forests, of course, are owned by the Crown, the provincial crowns, and so they can determine whether or not you are managing your forest management agreement. That's what the private sector does. It signs forest management agreements with the province, and you have to show that you're managing your forest properly and sustainably. But certainly, we need to do a better job of sustainability, of circularity, of persuading, not persuading through greenwashing, but actually demonstrating to those that are concerned about cutting down trees that it can be done sustainably. First of all, one of the initial feedstocks is waste wood, never mind cutting down trees. My brother-in-law has 300 acres of pine forest up in Renfrew County, and what he's taught me is, you know why I cut down those beautiful 30-meter pine straight as an arrow trees, Jeff? Because my young trees need light and space in order to be able to grow. So if I want my trees that are now 3 feet tall to get 30 feet tall or whatever, 30 meters, I need to harvest the mature trees. So, but we need to do a better job of that. On the circularity side, there's the question of, let's take advanced or second generation or so-called cellulosic ethanol. And so people say, well, when you burn ethanol, there are carbon emissions, and indeed there are. So you could just say, well, burning oil and gas is renewable if you want to wait 100 million years. So what happens on the ethanol side is that CO2 emissions from this year that are emitted this year are stored in next year's crop, and then next year's crop is harvested, and those CO2 emissions just get constantly recycled. So that's the circularity component of it. You know, a grocery store example would be that I buy food that comes in a plastic container. I should be able to take that plastic container back to the store where I bought it from. If I'm buying something at Foodland, why can't I take that plastic container back to Foodland, and Foodland then has to return it to their suppliers? That would be a good example of circularity. It doesn't happen. It goes in the blue bin and it never ends up getting recycled, but I'm getting off topic there. I want to talk a little bit about capital, because I don't work in the research and development end of the spectrum, okay? I work in the finance and public policy end of the spectrum, and Megan mentioned these are high CapEx projects. Sure, there's a role for government at fundamental research, applied research, piloting, demo, because you can build a demo plant. Okay, Iogen built its demo plant out on Hunt Club Road for $80 million. We got $10 million from the government of Canada. But then when you start talking, and when you even at an $80 million rate, but when you're talking building a full-scale commercial biorefinery, and think of a biorefinery the same as an oil refinery. You know, your oil refinery's got that huge 75-80% portion that is high volume, low margin fuels. You make 3 or 4 cents a liter selling gasoline. And then there's that little corner up there that's 10, 15, 20% that's specialty chemicals. And that's the part that where you make your money from a barrel of oil, like I was saying earlier, cosmetics, plastics, paints, all that stuff, which is low volume but very high margins. I always use the example of my wife will pay $10 for a tube of lipstick that costs 25 cents to make. So those are huge margins. Now, a tree or biomass is the same. You've got your high volume, low margin renewable fuels, and then you've got your specialty chemicals where you can make some decent return. But those plants are in the, as Megan was saying, you're talking about when Iogen was looking at building its biorefinery, it was going to cost $300 million. Well, there's no role for government there. I mean, other than putting in place the right policy environment. And now we get back to the whole idea of a national bioeconomy strategy that makes investors feel comfortable. What do investors say to me when they say, well, we'd love to build in Canada, but can you show us the government's plan for, what's the government's plan for making sure that this is going to be not become a stranded asset? And so they can look at the plan in the U.S., they can look at the plan in Finland or the European Commission, they can look at the plan in all kinds, like I said, 60 countries. There's nothing I can point to them in Canada and say, well, there's what the government's strategy is to make you feel comfortable. And we had people speaking at last week's Scaling Up conference saying, We would love to build a plant in Canada, but the regulatory environment is too uncertain. We will build in the U.S. because we know what to expect here. So, and when it gets to those high expensive capex projects like Megan was talking about, $100 or $300 or $500 million, the developer of the technology doesn't have that money either. So they're going to strategic investors looking for that investment. They're going to big oil companies, big chemical companies, big forestry companies, big ag companies. Those are the ones who are saying, we need to diversify, we need to get to net zero, we need to somehow figure out how to reduce our environmental footprint, and we'll do that by investing in these emerging technologies. And by the way, we can't be talking today, if we're thinking about 2030 and 2040, about technologies that are in the test tube. These have to be technologies that are already have built a demo plant, at least, if they're going to contribute anything by 2030. Anyway, I'm talking too much, so I'll just pass the mic.
So maybe just to give a couple more examples to build off of what Jeff was saying. I feel like we're talking a lot about the negatives and the barriers, but there is a lot of opportunity. But I'll just jump back to the barriers for just a sec, or the challenges. So without a strategy, without a national strategy, the policy and the regulatory, as Jeff said, are unreliable. So the investment is not going to be sound, so to speak. And if you use the U.S. as a prime example, their strategy came into play a couple of years ago in terms of a national bioeconomy strategy in the U.S. And as a result, they've had a bio-preferred program. They've had climate smart commodities investments program, and they've had more recently the Inflation Reduction Act. These are all significant either co-investments with government or significant tax and capex breaks on individual investments in projects. And I mean significant, like 50-cent dollars. So if you've got an early stage technology, and I'll mention that I was in Finland a few weeks ago at a Nordic biorefinery conference where they literally threw Canada under the bus. And I was one of, I think there were 5 Canadians in this group of 1,500 people. And they used Canada as the example to say probably the most interesting place to build a bioeconomy or circular economy project, but there is no policy, very little regulatory, and so investments will not work. It's just too high risk. And I was just sort of sitting there sinking in my chair thinking, oh my God, they're right. But they pointed to, as Jeff mentioned, we've got some of the best managed forests. We have some of the largest agricultural assets in our backyard. And then we've got additional assets that we don't think about in terms of assets that are either underutilized or you might consider stranded. So at one point in time, 50 years ago, which is just a generation here, so it's really not that long ago, right, Jeff? We had well over 1,000 pulp and paper mills in this country, and we're down to a few hundred now. A lot of those assets, in terms of their physical assets, piping, electrical infrastructure traveling through physical buildings still exist. Those are brownfield sites that we can use as investment attraction. And those are the perfect sites for a scaled up technology that would be coming from, say, Sweden or Finland or one of the EU countries that does not have the critical mass in terms of biomass to be able to sustain the scale up, but we do here in Canada. So we need to start to connect the dots along all of those pieces. And I'll throw one more challenge out there. Maybe we can sort of move into opportunities. But the pressure to decarbonize along industry is ramped up. It's almost logarithmic. The EU, as of next month, has put in play carbon border amendments, which are tariffs, and they are starting in the 18 to 20% range. So industries that are exporting into the EU, they're starting with the construction industry because they know it's highly carbonized in terms of things like rebar, steel, cement, 18 to 20% tariffs starting December 2023. They are adding an industry every quarter, if not 2 industries every quarter moving forward. We have little to no mechanisms to educate our industries here in our backyard that they are going to be facing significant tariffs. So if you are familiar with the policy and the programming around CETA, the Canadian-European trade agreements that were put into play a number of years ago, those are essentially all out the window with regards to the carbon border amendments that are coming into play. If we don't start doing something now, every industry and every company that exports in Canada, which is something like 70% of our companies in this country, are exporters. Anyone that's exporting into the EU is soon going to be facing significant tariffs, and it could be the end of their business. So, yeah.
So that was a lot of information, and it kind of demonstrates sort of the dark side of what the circular economy right now is at the moment in Canada. But from all that information, we can kind of tell that there's already a lot of resources that we have. The knowledge, the people, the technical aspect. We have all of that in Canada. So kind of reflecting back to you guys again, where are those opportunities? What are those next steps? We have these barriers with the policy side. We have some barriers on the VC side. What would your advice be if you had the ability to have that power to really drive this forward in order to get over those barriers? And I don't know. Do you want to start first?
Sorry, you want me to go?
Either Jeff or...
Well, the good news is that Canada is blessed. I mean, I won the lottery. I was born in what it's called Thunder Bay now. See, I'm so old that I was born in Fort William, but
he's not that old. He's just wise.
Fort William and Port Arthur were merged to form the town of Thunder Bay. So there you go. It's still called Lakehead University, though. So we're blessed, absolutely. We have unbelievable natural resources. Of course, we're blessed with oil and gas as well. But good news is that if we have the intestinal fortitude, as my father used to say, to back out at whatever speed is necessary, oil and gas, all the people who are working in that sector in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the bioeconomy needs those jobs. We need biologists, we need chemists, we need whatever, it doesn't matter. The jobs that exist right now in the oil and gas sector, the good news is, as you said, Megan, those people are trained and we can certainly pick up those jobs. The other good news, I used to live in Saskatoon, so everybody thinks of the prairies as just that flat and we grow canola and wheat and barley and oats. Well, 60% of Alberta is forest. 60% of Saskatchewan is forest. So, as soon as you get north of Prince Albert, the whole rest of Saskatchewan is mosquitoes and trees. So, and lakes with unbelievable sized fish, which is why the Americans all come up and fish up there. So, we are blessed with a huge resource, and Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are considered, oil and gas provinces, by the way, that's also where I mentioned 60 million hectares of ag land. Well, guess where all the ag land is? Yes, there's some in southwestern Ontario and the eastern townships, but most of it is in Saskatchewan and Alberta and somewhat in Manitoba. So they're the ones who should be driving the bioeconomy in Canada. And the premiers should stop hoping to discover the future by looking in the rearview mirror. That's not where the future lies. The future is biology. And I'm old enough to remember the movie The Graduate, and people of a younger generation always say, "Oh, your generation." You always go on and on about that movie, The Graduate. Well, of course, you remember Dustin Hoffman was a lost university graduate, didn't know what to do with his life, and the neighbor came over and whispered in his ear at the side of the pool, "Plastics, plastics." Well, I now have that in one of my speeches where I show that picture of Dustin Hoffman, but the bubble says biology. And so if I was a parent living in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and I had 10, 12, 14-year-old children, I would not expect them to grow up working in the oil and gas sector. They cannot be working in the oil and gas sector. So get them degrees in chemical engineering, biological engineering, biology, all the biological sciences, and in government relations and communications and all that other stuff, but don't expect them to be working in oil and gas. We've got the talent, we've got the resources, we just need the political will.
That's pretty positive. Megan, go ahead.
Maybe just to jump on that, we definitely have the talent and we have the ability to build more talent across our academic institutions across this country. And we need to leverage the resource endowment that Jeff mentioned that we're blessed with. First, we need to identify it and clearly identify it and leverage those assets. We need to better understand where the zones for procurement and opportunity lie within all of those resource-based sectors. And then we need to start looking at, and I shouldn't say need to, that this is just, it's going to happen. If it doesn't happen, our industries are going to start to collapse. Our businesses are going to start to collapse. Decarbonization is about productivity and competitiveness. This is not about, pushing a sector and saying you need to decarbonize. If we start to look at things like the carbon border amendments, if our businesses and our industries do not start to look at what their carbon footprint is and how they can actually decarbonize along their own value chains and within their processes, they will lose on the productivity and they will lose significantly on the competitiveness, which will mean they will die in the end. I keep going back to the negative. There's tons of opportunity in this country.
And then maybe we'll go over to Ryan. What are your thoughts on like the opportunities and maybe stay in the light a little bit more than the dark?
Well, I guess I opened up earlier with a comment about like the regionality, the sectorality, right? There's a lot of components in the circular bioeconomy or circular systems in general, and then a bioeconomy, an economy based on biology, right? And there's multiple sources of biomass. There's this concept of energy, putting these things together to sort of reduce the emissions, reducing our net contribution, achieving a net zero balance. But it goes beyond forestry, right? It goes into other sectors. Food is a notable one, right? The city of Guelph actually has put forward a very interesting circular food systems approach, platform implementation. They have a plan, they're resourcing it. And it's an example where, because circular food systems themselves are in a way very well integrated along the value chain, there's an ability to move some of those levers in smaller pieces within the system, and then moving, because of the diversity of what's available in Canada, and the fact that there are regional foci, and therefore strengths in those areas to be able to bridge and move across that. So it's an example here where, on a sector basis, you can start to develop really in those areas. So in food, let's say you're growing plant proteins, right, which in and of itself has a net benefit for climate change, for environmental, for health. But you produce plant protein, you're left with the rest of the plant. So you got the biomass. You've got the biomass for the power for your processing facility, right? You've got the biomass that can also provide into another area. But you've then got those, waste products. Don't call them waste, call them side streams, right? It's the stuff that comes along as you're processing, as you're moving along. You got a whole bunch of starch. What's starch? It's sugar. What do microbes need to grow? They need sugar. So there's this ability to then take those waste streams, that garbage, and turn it into gold, basically, right? To upscale, to valorize is the term that they use in Europe a lot. And so there's an example where, if you focus in on a particular sector, you can start to move the pieces because there's an integrated value proposition for them. As you start to improve these situations, it has an ability to improve the bottom line of the people, of all the different players involved. And in Canada, we have a supercluster dedicated to plant protein, for instance. So we have groups that are working really hard to bring in the investments that will allow us to retain these processing powers, these processing plants, which is good for our economy in a way, but also is part of what is important for circularizing our feedstocks, our systems. Because if we're exporting the raw material, we're getting rid of all of that other stuff that comes along that is required to fuel that circular economy, right? Otherwise, all you end up with is a bunch of garbage that you're dumping off, shipping around somewhere else, and your supply chains, your value chains remain linear instead of reconnecting to themselves. So jumping on the opportunities that's presented by the specific sectors within themselves, and then working really hard to connect across the sectors as well, moving along. So at that national level, that national framework, right? So again, this is an example where our federated ecosystem in Canada is actually a benefit, because we have economic drivers at the provincial level to make these pieces of the economy advance, as well as ultimately leading into a tie-up at the national level where the pieces can exchange, can move across, and with the right international partnerships, start exporting the technologies that will allow exchange and integration of these systems across borders as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask if we can maybe flip to the second polling question, please. So we're going to get you guys involved now in the crowd. I know it's been a late afternoon. We just had lunch. We're almost done the conference. It's been a long one. But if you guys don't mind, we're kind of going to ask you guys, what are you guys interested in hearing about next? So we've kind of heard a little bit about the investment side. We've heard a lot about the policy side. And then I'm going to kind of change that second question about stakeholders to also include in terms of our research capacity, what are some better ways to reach out to them and how do we connect them into the system? And I'll give a minute or so. And for those who don't know, it's, I think, through the app that you're able to select these polling questions. Yeah.
I just want to, while people are voting, just so everybody in the audience here doesn't think that we're just sitting up here whistling Dixie. In 2020, McKinsey Global Institute came out with a study that said that the global bioeconomy, and I'm talking now, you remember the opening remarks, I talked about the bioeconomy writ large. The global bioeconomy within 8 years will be $4 trillion a year. Is that a big number? Well, the Canadian GDP is just under $2 trillion. So $4 trillion is a huge number, more than half of which, I'm quoting here now from McKinsey, more than half of which will be in non-pharma. So in other words, over $2 trillion a year in what we're talking about here in this room today, the industrial bioeconomy. And it's being driven not only by biology, but all kinds of advances in, IT and computer engineering and all sorts of stuff where, back in the day when we were doing science in the lab at Iogen in the early 2000s, and it was so slow to do testing, and now it can all be done, what used to take weeks can be done in hours. So think about that number. $2 trillion a year globally, and it's a year we're talking here, not $2 trillion over a period of time. And so why can't Canada capture 10% of that global market? That would be $200 billion that we could add to our GDP if we could get focused on the industrial bioeconomy. 10% of the market, we got 9% of the world's forest, and I mentioned the ag land and so on. So we're not whistling Dixie here. There's a huge opportunity. And actually, the OECD has come out with its own report saying the McKinsey study is conservative in terms of what the potential is going to be.
And so it's kind of great that you bring up the McKinsey study, because the question that they want to ask about is investment. So how do we get this slice of the pie in Canada? How do we actually, become one of those kind of world leaders in this? And Jeff, I know you talked a lot. Megan, I don't know if you want to maybe start this round to give Jeff a little bit of a break.
Maybe I'll just add that that 10% is essentially the contribution of the oil and gas sector to our federal budget. So if we move away from fossil into bio and circularity, you can see that this is a moneymaker. This is we will actually be building on the economy. In terms of investment, we can mimic. There's a significant amount of policy related to investment that exists in most of the EU countries and even more closely in the US, which might be a little bit more comparable for us. We can mimic a lot of that policy around investment. There's also there's a handful of projects that are ongoing across Canada here. We're again playing catch up to the rest of the world to help identify those biomass development zones, so they're BDO zones. If we could support a few more of those projects across this country to essentially identify where have we got capacity in terms of assets, critical mass from a biomass perspective, and then the ability to either leverage existing underutilized or stranded assets all together in a region and basically draw these circles around these areas and these zones. Couple that with additional policy from the federal government, and we've essentially set up regions in Canada for direct investment. And we're talking direct investment from really large investment groups and banks. This isn't, investment coming from even an RBC, not necessarily big enough. So, yeah.
That's great. Maybe Jeff, you'd like to follow up, or Ryan?
Well, I think Jeff's got the greater depth and experience in here, so we'll let him book in. I'll just put a little page in there, I guess, in terms of the power. the rural regional development policies are going to be very important for making these happen. So we're talking about business development opportunity zones. Ultimately, you have to secure biomass, and so you have to move it. And so there's this trade-off point where when you're moving something too far, does it become net positive, net negative? Is it worth it? All these other inputs. If you're moving stuff around down the Mississippi on a solar-powered barge like they have in the States, you're shipping for pennies on the ton, right? We don't have that. We have rail lines. And we're not about to build a canal across the country to make water transportation happen, right? So there's a regionality perspective that needs to be leaned in on, but there's a development aspect that can go along with that. So the ability to do that, I think, is, I defer to experts in this space, but I know, if we look at our neighbor to the south that has been able to sort of develop these aspects a little bit more. When I was down there building a facility in rural Georgia, the reason that we were able to secure the funds to build the large capex is that it was something called an economic opportunity zone. So basically, this is a designation that the federal government in certain states has said this is a developing area. So we will create policies that enable you to recoup at a higher rate some value off of your investment, as long as basically you invest in this area, as long as you keep your investment and all the cap gains in it for 10 years, you get those cap gains tax-free. And so it basically incentivizes renewed, continuous investment into an area. And so because of the regionality aspect, you essentially need to be developing these hubs. And so policies that will allow us to invest in developing regional strength, regional areas, that also sort to incorporate cutting-edge technologies. Because one of the problems when you're operating a plant, if you spent $300 million building it, you can't put it on pause to test out a new technology, right? Like that thing has to operate 24/7. So you need to develop a way to integrate these cutting-edge technologies into the process, into the pipeline, into that system in a way that is economically sustainable and doesn't disrupt the ways that move forward. Another aspect I think that we really benefited from when we were in the States was we were going to investors who, we were a synbio company, so we engineered microbes to chew up sugar, and instead of turning it into alcohol, you turned it into high-value chemicals, food ingredients, stuff that you wish you could get from nature, but you were going to drive a species extinct in order to get it, right? Which is great for VC, right? They're looking at this and like, 10x, I'm going to invest in this stuff, right? But then you go to somebody who's going to foot the bill for building a manufacturing facility. They're not going to accept that. You're like, what? Your technology isn't completely de-risked. I cannot afford to spend the risk required to build this facility because my margins on the manufacturing side are not 10x, right? They are much, much, much smaller percentages. So they need something that is completely de-risked. And so policies that will allow us to overcome that risk barrier, whether through insurance type systems that allow us to cover it, or through guaranteed loans secured by, not necessarily government procurement, but government guarantees on our investments, would go a long way towards enabling us to bridge that tech to pilot to then scale, where I think these other policies are very, very important as well.
And finally, Jeff.
So we're talking about investment. This will be the shortest comment I'll make in this entire panel. Certainty equals investment. That's what we need. Certainty equals investment. I mean, I spent 12 years of my life working together with Shell as a strategic investor in an Ottawa-based company called Iogen, and they couldn't have been more clear about the need for certainty. And why? Because as a public company, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And so they need to know that if they're going to put in a whole lot of money and build a plant, that it's not going to be a stranded asset. So we need to know that the policy is there for the long time. And by the way, I'm a big fan of policy over programs. Programs come and go, and then what you end up doing is you have to lobby the government to renew the program. It was put in place for 4 years, 5 years, whatever it was. Whereas, and I'll give you a very good example of this. I used to work for the Canadian Wind Energy Association back in the 90s, and we managed after 3 budget cycles. So this is not easy. This is heavy lifting. And we managed to get the government, through the help of then Finance Minister Paul Martin and then what was called Energy Mines Resources, now Enercan Minister Anne McClellan, to get something called CSPC, the Conservation, Renewable, Canadian Conservation Renewable Energy Expenses. Anyway, it's a flow-through share mechanism for wind and other renewable projects, including, for example, geothermal. Well, that was put in place when Paul Martin was finance minister, and it's still there today. And that's an example of how policy, is more long-term certainty than programs which come and go, and you have to worry about, is the next government going to renew it, and so on. CRCE, look that up. The other thing is, we're in a bit of a hurry here. So we do not need to reinvent the wheel. Don't do what Environment Canada did with our clean fuel standard. We begged Environment Canada, just copy California. And if you can't copy California, just copy BC, because BC copied California. Well, they didn't, and that's why it came 4 years late. And it's a dog's breakfast. But anyway, if we're talking about a national bioeconomy strategy, 60 countries in the world have strategies. We don't need to sit down with a blank piece of paper and say, how are we going to figure out a strategy for Canada? Look at what the U.S. did in 2012. Look at Costa Rica's, which is fantastic, actually. Look at the European Commission's, and just copy it. Just do the same thing. We don't have time to reinvent the wheel. Anyway, I'm getting all excited here, so I better stop.
Are there any other comments from either of the other panelists? On that note, one kind of follow-up question before we jump to the audience, if you guys have any questions for us, is, so Ryan, you mentioned rural regions and trying to get the economy started there. And if you think about where a lot of our biomass is, it's not at the universities, it's not in downtown Toronto, clearly. It's on the rural countries and sides where the pulp mills are, where our biomass is from an aquaculture setting. So in that case, how would you promote, and it's not directed directly to Ryan, but to all three of you, how would you promote better economic incentives to go to those areas? So we talked about BDO zones as one option, but what are other mechanisms that will actually drive that economic development in those regions, and then maybe put the plants and the manufacturing centers there in order to be able to process and actually get the circularity system sort of started?
So maybe I'll just jump in and say our biomass is in rural regions in this country. It is what it is, and that will be a connector to create jobs in the future. The other sort of connecting piece associated with that is, if we think about, we need to do a better job of illustrating the value chains so we understand where that biomass is going and how it's going to be used. It's going to be coming from those rural regions, but we need to connect those dots again. So I'll give you an example of a project that BIC has taken on recently, and it has to do with the St. Lawrence corridor and the automotive sector, I guess. BIC has an investment arm called Sustainable Chemistry Alliance Investments, and we invest in early stage technology companies, and two of those companies happen to be working with the automotive sector, one on circularity around batteries and the other one around water resources and renewing water resources within the automotive sector. A third investment that we are hoping to do is coming out of Quebec, and it's actually on the forestry side. And the hope is to connect the entire value chain. So we've got Trois-Rivières, southern Quebec. We've got the automotive I guess, sort of hub, which is in southern Ontario. And then we're actually connecting that with soy and flax growers, again, in Manitoba. So it's all going into one sector, so to speak, but it's about connecting those. And all of the jobs that will be happening around Trois-Rivières and Mauricie are going to be rural. All of the jobs within that Manitoba group are going to be rural and ag-related jobs. The only ones that are even remotely close to a city are going to be southern Ontario around the automotive sector.
Ryan or Jeff?
Right. Your comments are always better, so it's better to book on that at the end. One thing from... Because I've been at it for 40 years. Refined. Coming from an organization that really, is on the cutting edge of genomics and biotechnology, right? The genomics is the science that enables us to use life to engineer, to deliver things, right? Like whether it's wood or food that is going to be climate adapted, or materials like plant-based plastic, or not only plant-based plastic, but the technology that allows you to actually recycle it, right? Because there's no point in taking corn stover and turning it into a plastic bottle if you just throw it in the ocean, right? So there's an element required here for the circularity, and that's education. And so it's education in how we consume, right? Everything surrounding all of this, whether it's circularity and all this stuff, comes down to that. At the end of the day, we need to consume. We are living organisms, right? That is what life is. It's a chemical reaction that consumes more chemicals to sustain itself. We just happen to have, as a biosphere, evolve into a very, very big, very complicated chemical reaction. And so being able to have people appreciate the opportunities without shying away from the risks is going to be a very big need here when we're going to be deploying biology to solve problems, right? There's a history. You look at the history of genetically modified organisms in food, right? Whether the science is pointing in a particular direction or not, different jurisdictions, different groups will believe certain things. And once you have these certain beliefs, they're very, very difficult to shake, right? And so, especially from the context of the rural environment, I come from Northern Ontario. I love where I come from, but I'll say that smaller populations, more isolated, tend to be more homogenous in beliefs and ideologies. So being able to engage with these communities in a proactive way to open the door to the promise of these technologies, the promise of these businesses. Yes, you're going to have to work with gene-edited crops and gene-edited systems if we're going to be able to produce biomass in our changing climate, right? We talked about forests occupying the northern half of Saskatchewan. Well, by 2050, there's going to be a lot more farmland creeping up north into Saskatchewan, right? And so getting these people to appreciate the value, getting these communities, I should say, to appreciate the value that is created, and sort of recognize that, you know, the retention of resources, talent, and I can't call it repatriation, but attraction of the urbanized transfer, or the transfer of people to urban environments back to that rural environment, is going to be absolutely critical. So a big component of it is science education and economic education.
Ryan, it's not that my comments are more interesting than yours. It's that yours are science-based and mine are market and finance-based, and they're both equally valid. They just hopefully can complement one another. You know, I don't want to gloss over the bioeconomy development opportunity zones that both Amy and Megan mentioned, because if you are a small rural community, and as I mentioned, I spent some time growing up in Saskatchewan, and there are a lot of rural communities there looking at their biomass and saying, and they have economic development officers. I mean, these are communities with, 10, 50,000 population. So they say, gee, what can we do to attract investment to our community? And fortunately, there's a Canadian company who, in typical fashion, has been, the Americans are all over him. I mean, this company, EcoStrat, is from Toronto, but he's doing so much more business in the U.S. because of the enthusiasm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Energy. But nevertheless, he's trying to do also so-called BDO zones, bioeconomy development opportunity zones in Canada, where he'll go into a particular, or his firm rather, backed by all kinds of science and finance and banks and everything else, and look at a region and give it a rating, either an A+ or an A rating, based on the amount of biomass available in a given community. And the economic development officers that we've spoken to have said that ever since they got a BDO zone rating for their community, their phone, I wouldn't say it never stops ringing, but they've been getting a lot more phone calls from investors saying, oh, we see that you got an A rating for, the amount of biomass in your given area, and we've been looking at where we should locate a plant. As someone who, when I was executive VP at Iogen, had to figure out where we were going to locate our Canadian plant, and ultimately we didn't build one in Canada, we built it in Brazil because it was so much cheaper. But nevertheless, when we were looking at Canada, I was the one who was going into rural Alberta, rural Saskatchewan, rural Manitoba, talking to communities who were desperate for economic development opportunities. And this BDO zone designation helps companies leapfrog that whole search that's required, because we spent years searching the three prairie provinces, trying to figure out where's the best area. And, that includes not just how much biomass there is, but what's the infrastructure like? Road, rail, water, electricity, and so on. And local community support. You speak to the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club, and you make sure that the community is on board with this before you even think about putting a sign up saying there's going to be a shovel going in the ground here. So the whole idea of a bioeconomy development opportunity zone helps communities advertise themselves. We're here and we've got a BDO zone designation, but it also helps the private sector in terms of, wow, look where we could go that somebody's done a whole bunch of homework for us already. So that is a real wonderful, economic instrument. I do want to just add parenthetically, and I know we're probably running out of time, but one of the most important messages that was delivered last week at the Scaling Up conference was delivered by Munich Re. Now, many of you may have heard of Swiss Re, the reinsurance companies. What's a reinsurance company? Megan wants to build a project that costs her $150 million. She goes to 4 or 5 different insurance companies that provide her insurance for that project. But the insurance companies themselves are a bit nervous. I insured Megan for $20 million. I insured the other guy. So they go to the reinsurance companies and say, okay, reinsurance companies insure insurance companies. Well, guess what Munich Re said last week? We are no longer reinsuring coal plants and tar sands plants. We are so worried about extreme weather events and the amount of insurance claims that are going to be made on us by the insurance companies that we've reinsured, we're going to go broke. So we only have one of 2 choices, well, 3 choices. We can either put up our premiums, which they're doing, which makes insurance more expensive, or we can go out of business, or I can't even remember what the third one I was going to say is, but the point is, insurance drives commerce. And if you cannot get insurance, you will not build your plant. And the reinsurance companies are saying we are no longer going to insure, and it's going to be gradually phased out because, of course, they're already heavily insuring already have insurance policies with fossil fuel projects. But going forward, they're no longer going to insure fossil projects. I think that was the most important message that could have been delivered at my conference that more government officials need to start to understand. You talked about where Canada is not, on board with this carbon adjustment tax. Well, we also need to, there's a whole world of stuff happening out there. I've been at this 40 years, and you know what I've concluded? Canada's not a serious country. I'm sorry.
Mic drop moment. Well, that was a lot in terms of comments from the side of policy, from the side of the science, and then a lot on the investment side and where the money is actually coming from, which is very, very important. But on that note, I'd like to open up the floor, and I don't know where the mic is going to be coming from. Oh, there's one there, and I clearly can't see it. It's behind the podium. If you have any questions, by all means, please come up and feel free to ask any.
Ask questions. Andrew, you had all kinds of great questions when we started this.
Don't be shy. I promise they don't bite.
Thanks for this. This has been really interesting. Your discussion has made me remember a presentation I saw from an economist from Harvard. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. But she talked about the challenge with how we use our resources is that we don't price what we make adequately, that we don't price not just the labor and the materials that go into making your plastic widget, but we don't put a price on the impact on the environment from making it or at the end of its life, getting rid of that plastic in the economy. So I'm wondering, would somehow, I don't know how to do that, but somehow forcing industry to have the full value of whatever they make, would that be an incentive to move to your economy? And is there a way to do that? Is there a way to say you're not pricing your product properly?
So I'm happy to sort of chime in there. Couple of things. Anyone here come from a farming family? Look at that. Yeah. So we in this country we don't have a great history of actually valuing the resources that come off our farmland, first of all. Secondly, exactly what you talked about around that circularity, that is the premise behind those carbon border amendments. So I mentioned that our companies, both, multinational or, SMEs, small, medium enterprises, we haven't done any education in this country to say, you need to understand what your carbon footprint is, whether that happens to be a life cycle analysis or some mechanism. We have not been educating, and we haven't been talking to companies, and we haven't been pushing or forcing them. That carbon border amendment is going to force them to do it, because if they cannot demonstrate what their carbon footprint is, they're getting taxed, and they're getting taxed heavily. So it's that exact premise that you just brought up. We need to start doing that here in Canada. It is going to have a massive, massive impact. And we need to start looking at it along the entire value chains and then the logistics supply chains. And I'll throw one more quick little piece out. Anyone here shop at IKEA? Yeah. Okay. If you have been to IKEA in the last year and a half, 2 years, you've probably noticed a lot of empty shelves. And, folks are saying, oh, well, it's logistics supply chains because of COVID, right? 7 years, might be a little bit more than that. IKEA put a notice out to all of the suppliers within their supply chain and basically said, we've got ESG standards, environmental sustainability goals and standards in play. If you are not helping us meet them, if you cannot tell us what your greenhouse, what your GHG footprint is, if you cannot give us some sort of a life cycle analysis, you are no longer a supplier. They lost 50% of their supply chain overnight. So it took a little while for that to sort of trickle down, but that is the primary reason why we do not have things on IKEA shelves anymore, because they laid the hammer down and said, this is it. We want to be a sustainable company, and if it means losing half of our supply chain, but it pushed and started to force their supply chain to go, shit, we got to man up here from an environmental standards perspective.
Talking about farming. Manure, yeah. So listen, we've been talking for decades about externalities need to be internalized. So just a warning, and I love this Western Canadian expression, let's be careful that we're not all hat, no cattle.
For those who get it, would have laughed. For those who not, it's okay. I didn't get it either. Any other questions? Please come up forward.
Hi, I also have a question, and I also just wanted to say I'm coming from Fort William, present-day Thunder Bay, so that's nice to hear. Anyway, you mentioned that 60 countries have a national bioeconomy strategy, and given that our biomass is often located not only in rural regions, but in regions with Indigenous communities and non-traditional territories, I was just wondering, when we're looking to these countries as an example for Canada, whether you're aware of any examples that have successfully braided in the Indigenous populations of their country.
That's a very interesting question, and I don't have any examples that I can think of. I mean, if you look at Europe, their founding peoples, First Nations. I mean, Canada's in a rather unique position, even compared to the Americans. We're in a rather unique position. By the way, I bet you your birth certificate doesn't say Fort William. So, but the good news is that we did have last week 3 First Nations at the Scaling Up conference, and the reaction, it wasn't the first time that one of them had attended as a AZA, as a First Nation from Thunder Bay, and then we had a couple from Nipigon, and which is just, you know where Nipigon is, not far. And but the reaction we had was, this is absolutely fantastic information. We've made so many good contacts, and next year we want to make sure there are even more First Nations attending the conference, because, I mean, it's not like they're going to necessarily make, recyclable bio-based plastics, but they're very interested in getting off diesel. So, that's a small step in the bioeconomy, but, and of course, not all First Nations approach the question the same way. Some are much more aggressive than others and much more business focused than others. And there will be those who, never mind just replacing our diesel boiler with a wood-fired boiler, we want to attract a biorefinery to our region, because and if you look at the Thunder Bay region, we've got lots of biomass up there. So, that could be a next step. But thanks for your question. I think it's something to think about in terms of what other countries may have done. I think Canada's in a bit of a unique position, certainly on the reconciliation front. But thanks for your question. Thanks also for your question. We didn't say thank you, but
just to comment on that, I'm not actually aware of areas around the world that have integrate a lot of these things. I think you can see in some of the more advanced bioeconomy strategies, that there's other socio-environmental benefits really looped in right away, right? Like the Finnish model really emphasizes the biodiversity benefits of circularity. And sort of, there's also this sort of subtext of benefits to sort of developing nations, global south, with the system. And it kind of makes sense in that if you're a developing economy, you're positioned to be able to develop circular systems, develop circular supply chains as investment grows. So let's say like Nigeria, which is exploding. They were well on the way with their biomass approach. The conflict in Ukraine has unfortunately fortunately for them, resulted in massive investments in their gas industry. But there's still an ability to, before you get this sunk cost with existing infrastructure, to advance and start to develop it and moving forward. But those are more sort of developed nations. I think in Canada, I think there's a unique opportunity here in that circularity is a concept that our Western extractive philosophies has gotten away from. And I think traditional indigenous knowledge systems are inherently, they're systems based, and they have an inherent circularity in them. So we absolutely need to have those voices represented at the policy table. And in terms of the economic development and those things, I mean, there's a variety of other issues that have to be tackled to make that possible. But at the very least, at the forefront, it would be a huge loss if that voice was not at the forefront of the discussion in circularity. Yeah, exactly.
Great question. Thank you. Next up.
So I want to ask a question relating to time to impact, because I think Jeff made a remark saying that anything that isn't already at the pilot sort of scale facility is unlikely to produce impact on the net 2030 kind of goals, right? So if researcher funders are typically funding academic institutes to produce deliverables and technologies that come out at technology readiness level 0 to 3, and industry sort of scale receptors need stuff at TRL 6 to 9, where would you say relative weighting on where to place the bets in terms of the money can't be 100% on end stage stuff, but it also can't be 100% on early stage discovery because it's never going to get there in adequate time to produce the impact, maybe not even for 2050.
I may have said, but the government's focus and the only ability the government has is to invest in fundamental research, applied research, pilot, and maybe demo. But even at the demo stage, and I gave the Iogen example, which was a plant that cost us $80 million. By that point, the government was running out of money. I mean, they gave $10 million on an $80 million project. Then when it came to go commercial, there was no government involvement, and there shouldn't be. By the time you've built a demo plant, if you don't know whether or not you've got something that's going to work at the commercial level, then why should the government use taxpayers' money and take that risk? So that's where you go to the strategic investors like, we did with Shell, and say, okay, we think we've got a facility here that can successfully work at commercial scale. So government money is at the front end of that spectrum. What I was making the point, though, was that when it comes to trying to achieve our 2030 goals, from a policy perspective, the government needs to be focused on what do we need to do to drive stuff that's already at the, Canada's got, I call it an R&D backlog. We've got all this stuff that isn't getting pulled off the shelves, like we need more market pull. Megan referred to the U.S. Department of Agriculture Biopreferred program that's been in place for 2 decades. We've been talking to Agriculture Canada for almost 2 decades. Why can't we have something similar in Canada? Just in case you don't know, the Biopreferred program, the U.S. Department of Agriculture independently certifies, you can't certify yourself, obviously, independently certifies that whatever you're making, whether it's diapers or pencils or, missiles for the U.S. Navy, if it can be demonstrated that it's minimum 30% bio-based, then the government must, by law, procure that product over the ones that don't have a certification. Well, can you imagine how much stuff the U.S. government consumes because it does include the military? So this creates unbelievable market pull for bio-based products and materials. By the way, the good news, since we're talking about good news here, is that it's not limited to American companies. If Trump had known that, he would have killed that program right away. But you can be a Canadian company and get USDA biopreferred certification and sell into the U.S. market. So you can go to the grocery store. I've seen laundry detergent that has USDA certification on it at the Foodland near where I live, you know. I mean, it's a wonderful market pull. But anyway, back to your question. Government money at the front end, government policy all through the spectrum, but particularly at the back end, you know, you need that certainty that the market is going to be there, and creating a government procurement program sure provides a certain degree of that certainty.
Unfortunately, we are at time, and I know that there's one question left.
Okay.
I feel like, are you guys okay
allowed?
with that question being asked? Go ahead then.
So I think it was Jeff mentioned that there's $1 trillion market for bioeconomy, or $2 trillion. Is that been segmented anyway? Because you said if we get 10% of the market, we'd be doing really well. Peter Drucker once said on the company level that if you have 10% of the global market, you better decide whether you're on your way in or you're on your way out, because you can't sustain it at only 10% of the market. So if there's a 10% opportunity, is it segmented, and what segment should we take so that our companies can have more than 50% of that particular part of the market?
Well, the McKinsey report was not segmented. It basically looked at the global opportunity and said, I mean, it segmented in
but where are the opportunities for our companies?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right. There's a need to focus. And a number of American companies have decided, for example, I gave the thing about, you know, high margin, low volume, and so on. And some of the companies that originally thought they were going to get into the renewable fuels business have decided, no, we're going to focus on cosmetics. And all we're going to do is focus on cosmetics, because we can have, you know, more than 10% of that market. So that's 50. One. Yeah, well, or 50. Anyway, Megan wants to say something. You've probably got some companies that you guys are supporting that are focusing.
I know we're wrapping up. I would say let's take a look at where we've got strengths in this country, especially around manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and then illustrate the value chains associated with those, and then look at where biochemicals and biomaterials will fit in. And I think that's exactly where we need to play.
And on that note, everybody, thank you so much for listening in. I know we went a little bit over time. Thank you to our panelists on stage.